Hello everyone, welcome to the Facebook Live. We're just waiting for a few more people to join us, so we'll just be waiting until that happens before we start properly. But please do start thinking. If you've got questions for us, type them in the chat, or just tell us in the chat where you're coming from, where you are in the world, and please share this link with friends and family as well. It's great to have more people involved. We'll be telling you all about the flower, we'll be telling you what we're doing with it, telling you what's happening around it at the moment, but we'll just wait till we've got a few more people joined. We can see there are quite a few people joining. Can you hear me properly? If you can, please put a thumbs up or a yes in the chat. If you can't, a no or a thumbs down, and then we can adjust the microphone and so on. So please do let us know. Can you hear? Where you are? If you've got questions for us already, we'd love to start seeing those coming in. I hope that that's worked, that people are hearing us. I'm just asking Helen, who's behind the camera here and who's writing me notes on what's happening. She says, yes, it looks like people can hear, and it looks like we've got more people coming in and joining us as well. So we'll just keep waiting for a few more minutes before we start properly. I hope that you can see the flower here up next to me and the cameras as well. It's nice to be talking to you from where you've been watching the camera, where you've been watching the flower from the last few days. You can probably see the time-lapse camera here and the webcam as well. So I've just had a note that I should be talking a bit louder. I'm going to try and do that and hope that that makes it easier for you to hear me. Please let us know if you can't hear properly. Please do pop that in the chat and we'll try and respond.
So Beverly, people have said that the mic needs to be louder. Maybe just explain that we're on a ladder.
Okay, so I've got notes in the chat saying that the microphone needs to be a bit louder. That's quite hard to do because I'm actually 12 feet up on a ladder and the microphone is sort of wired to the base of the ladder. So I'll just talk a bit louder and hope that does what we need. And I'll also try and aim talking into the microphone a bit so that you can make sure you can hear us properly. I'm joined today by Alex Summers, our glasshouse supervisor, and he's much louder than me, so you'll probably hear him better when it's his turn to talk to you. He's laughing now because I've said that, but he's famous here for always being quite on the loud side. Okay, I think we'll probably make a start then now because we've got a good number of people have joined us. So welcome to this Facebook Live. Thank you so much for coming to join me tonight and to hear all about our amazing moonflower, which has flowered today. I'm Beverly Glover. I'm the director of the Cambridge University Botanic Garden, and I'm talking to you from 12 foot up this ladder against our water chestnut tree here in the tropical glasshouse at the Botanic Garden. I hope you can see the flower. You're not getting a perfect close-up view on this Facebook Live. We'll be sharing close-up pictures on our social media over the next day or so you'll be able to see those. But for today, we thought you'd like to see where it is and also where we've been filming from. So you can see next to me the camera that's taking the webcam, the black one here, and then the silver one here is taking a time-lapse series, which we'll also share on our social media tomorrow. So you can see where they are. And they're also up on a hanging off a gantry here in the balcony of the glasshouse to get a good shot of this flower, which is, as I said, 12 foot up the trunk of our water chestnut tree. You can see the cactus has climbed up the tree. So we're really, really excited to be here sharing this with you tonight. It's the first time that one of these moonflowers has flowered anywhere in the UK. So there are only about 13 in cultivation around the whole world. They're very rare in cultivation, and we think this is the only one in the UK to have flowered. Loads of people have been sending us in photos and questions about their moonflowers. There are some common cactuses in cultivation which have the same common name, but they're not this. This is Selenicereus whittii. It's from the Amazon jungle, so it's from the region near Manaus in Brazil, and it's been very rarely seen in the wild and even more rarely grown in cultivation. So to have it in flower here tonight is just fantastic for us. It's really super exciting. And thank you for sharing that excitement. We've loved all the comments on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook over the last few days. It's really been great to see so many people joining in and loving the flower with us. That's what Botanic Gardens are for, to share the joy of plants with people, and it's been fantastic to know that that's been working for you. We've been enjoying that too. So I'm joined by Alex Summers, who's our glasshouse supervisor. He's actually responsible for growing and looking after the plant. And I'm going to take your questions for 5 minutes or so about the science of the plant and about the flower that it produces. And then I'll swap places, so you'll see some ladder climbing up and down, and Alex will be here to talk about how he grows it, how he looks after it, and so on. And behind the camera here, we've got Helen, who's looking for your questions and will pass them on to me. If you can't hear the questions or can't hear my answers, again, please do pop that in the chat. We're all obviously having to work with social distancing, so we're all a bit spread out, and it's all a bit put together not quite string and Lego, but it feels a bit like it. So I'm a bit wobbly here on the ladder, but it's great to be talking to you.
So Beverly, we've got a question from Zoe. How does it smell?
So Zoe's asked how it smells. And it's not like I thought it would be, actually. I've never seen one of these flower before either. It's quite subtle, but sweet. So you kind of get it in wafts. And if I do that, I can smell it. It's sweet. There's a set of compounds that plants that flower at night, like this one does, often make. So compounds like methyl benzoate and methyl jasmonate, and they give a scent that's attractive to hawk moths. And I think that's what I'm picking up here. It's a bit like being near a gardenia, or some of the honeysuckles actually you might have in your garden, or a jasmine. I'm getting some of those flavours from it. But plants are really clever. These flowers don't just produce one chemical when they make a scent. They produce a whole bouquet of tens or even hundreds. And so it's really hard to sort of take it to pieces and work out what you're smelling. But it's definitely nice. I recommend it.
And one question we had earlier, which chemicals make it smell good at first and then bad?
Okay, so a question about what chemicals are making it smell good at first and then bad later, because we're expecting the smell to get worse as we go into the evening. It's supposed to turn quite unpleasant later in the night. I don't think we know the answer to that. So, like I said, the chemicals that are making it smell good, those are better described, and lots of flowers make those in different combinations to make their own particular perfume. So the perfume of each flower is a mix of those chemicals. There's going to be a chemical change to make that bad smell later. Plants that smell bad are often producing amines, so nitrogen-based compounds, but until I smell it, I don't really know. So I'll see what I can find out with my nose later, and we'll put that onto our social media and let you know what we find out.
A question from George. What advantage does it serve to the plant to have such a short flowering period?
So George is asking what advantage there is to the plant of having such a short flowering period. That's a really good question. It's probably about, if you think about it this way, a cost-benefit analysis. So if you look at this flower, and I hope you can sort of see my hands in comparison, it's 28 centimetres long, it's about 15 centimetres across. It's really vulnerable to predation. So this is a plant that gets through its life by camouflaging itself, by growing up the trunk of this tree. It doesn't have leaves. Those are stems that are doing the photosynthesizing. It spends all of its time trying to avoid being visible to herbivores. And then suddenly it produces this enormous, great white flowering thing that smells and stands out, well, stands out like all sorts of things that you've mentioned in the chat. I'm going to stop there. It's a really obvious lure for pollinators, which is what the flower wants. What the plant is trying to do is get itself pollinated, get its pollen transferred to another flower to produce seed, and to get pollen transferred onto this one to produce seed. But it's also a risk. It makes it much more vulnerable to predation. And so probably what's happening here is that the plant is investing all its resources in a really showy flower, but only for a short period of time. And then it'll close up and set fruit and be, again, camouflaged and hidden until it flowers again next year.
Why do they flower at night? And an earlier question was, should we be calling it a sunflower because ours flowered in the day?
So why did it flower at night? Why do they flower at night, and why didn't ours flower at night? Should we call it a sunflower, not a moonflower? They flower at night because the animal that pollinates them is a night-flying hawk moth. So if you think about the flowers in your garden, you'll find that there are some that flower in the day, and those are ones that are pollinated by bees and butterflies. And then there are some that flower at night, and those are things that are pollinated by moths. So again, honeysuckles often have their strongest scent at night. Or if you've ever grown petunias in a window box, you often get a strong scent in the evening. And that's because one of the parents of the garden petunias we grow is a moth-pollinated species. So this is trying to attract night-flying moths. They make very good pollinators. They can carry a lot of pollen around, and the flower has a lot of anthers producing a lot of pollen. But there's no point in flowering in the day if you're trying to attract a night-flying animal. Now ours has obviously got a bit confused. Plants know what time of day it is according to an internal circadian rhythm, we call it. It's just like we have. So a plant can get jet lag, for instance, if you take it on a plane to somewhere else. And just like us, it can reset its internal rhythm. It uses cues from light to help it work out what time of day it ought to be. So just like we do in order to get over jet lag. So our plant is obviously a little bit muddled. Its circadian rhythm isn't quite right. That could be because of the lighting in our glass house. It's also, of course, evolved to live in an environment where days are 12 hours long and nights are 12 hours long. And it's growing here in Cambridge in February. The days are quite a lot shorter than 12 hours. So that will also have confused it as well. So it has come out a bit earlier than we expected. But it's always good that they surprise us.
From Hannah, might it be connected to the phase of the moon?
So Hannah asks whether it might be connected to the phase of the moon. We honestly don't know enough to answer that, Hannah. We haven't got enough data on when they flower in the wild to know whether there's a phase of the moon connection in there or not. It's something I'd love to know more about, but that we're going to need some field work out into Brazil to do that.
A couple more questions. Is it monocarpic? Is it dioecious? Can it be self-pollinated? Or does the pollen need to be traded with another plant?
So lots of botanical questions there. Is it monocarpic? Is it dioecious? Can it self-pollinate? So monocarpic means does it flower just once and then die? No, we hope not. We're told by colleagues who've grown them in Germany that it should continue to survive after flowering and that it should produce more flowers in future years. We're hopeful about that. I'd really like to be able to study them for my scientific research, and that really means dissecting them and taking them to pieces, and I don't want to do this when we've only got one, but if we have more in future years, I'd like to do that. Is it dioecious? Dioecious means separate male plants and female plants, so people are dioecious, if you like. No, I can see both male and female reproductive structures very clearly here in this one individual flower. Most plants aren't dioecious, some are. The holly bushes in your garden are, for instance, but this one isn't. It's got both male and female structures. And can it be self-pollinated? Well, Alex is going to try. He's very, very keen to try. We're watching for the stigma here to become receptive so that we can put some of the pollen onto it. My money would be on no. The cactus family aren't very good at self-pollinating. They usually need pollen from another individual, so they can recognise self-pollen using a mechanism just like our immune systems recognise self and non-self to reject bugs, pathogens. In this case, plants recognise self-pollen and reject it, and I think it's very likely this plant will do that because most cactuses do. But we'll see. It's definitely worth trying, because if we can get some seed, we can share that with other botanic gardens, increase the number of people who'll be able to see it, and increase the number of scientists who'll be able to study it. So that would be fantastic for us.
Fiona has said, is this the first time a moonflower has flowered during the day?
Fiona says, is it the first time a moonflower has flowered during the day? We have so little data. Very few things are the first time with plants. Our colleagues in Germany, in Bonn and Berlin, who've grown them and flowered them in botanic garden glass houses like this, theirs are flowered at night, and they flower at about 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the evening. So it's the first one we know of flowering this early in the day in cultivation. What they do in the wild, though, is anybody's guess, and I'm pretty sure that there'll be some variation. Just like people are different, all individual plants are different from one another.
From Enza, what will happen to the flower once it's died? Will we be preserving it? And maybe you can talk about your science and what you'll be doing.
So Enza asks what we're going to do with the flower when it's died. Well, we'll pollinate it. Alex will try and pollinate it, and we'll wait to see if it sets fruit. And if it does, it'll be this long part here, the receptacle, that swells up and produces that fruit. But I suspect it won't. So what will we do with it? Well, I'll be waiting eagerly to know as soon as Alex lets me have access to the flower. I'd like to collect what still remains and do some research on it. I'm very interested in the control of the number of tepals. I hope you can see here. There are probably about 100, and I'd like to know how they're produced, whether that's a fixed number or whether it varies. I'd also very much like to open the flower up along its length and have a look at the position of the base of the male and female reproductive organs, the stamens and the carpel, because if we believe what we've seen in the literature, those should be right down at the base here, and they've had to grow all the way along to be at the same length as this receptacle, the fleshy green bit, has grown. And I'd love to know how that's controlled. Are those organs talking to one another? How do they control their length to all end up at the same length at the same day when it opens? But to do that, I'll have to be able to dissect it. So I'll be keeping my fingers crossed that I can do that and that it won't have withered completely.
We've got a cross-section of that on the website, haven't we?
Yeah, so we have a drawing of a cross-section on the website, and also a picture of a preserved cross-section from another flower grown elsewhere in the world. But we're also, of course, keen to get as many photographs as we can and to draw it ourselves, to get as much information as we possibly can from this one flower.
Before we change over, Beverly, how do they reproduce if they flower for such a short time?
So the question is, how do they reproduce if they flower for such a short time? Well, it produces actually quite a lot of nectar. So flowers that are pollinated by moths tend to produce a really big volume of nectar. 5 or 10 or even 15 millilitres isn't unusual in a moth-pollinated flower, so that's about 2 or 3 teaspoons. And so it's a really good reward. Although it might only be around for one night, any hawk moth that does see it is going to go, wow, that's a real bonus for me. I'm going to get a really good meal out of that. And so it's a sort of very short-lived but very high likelihood of success pollination system. And so it's very likely to get pollinated, be able to set that fruit and produce the next generation.
What family is it in, and are they always white?
What family is it in, and are they always white? It's in the family Cactaceae. Oh, I see I've been joined by a cockroach. That's always nice. It'll be time for me to swap soon with Alex in that case. They're in the Cactaceae, so the cactus family. And no, they're not always white, so you might have seen Christmas cactuses, perhaps quite common, or other cactuses that you can buy in the garden centre, often have pinkish or red flowers, also yellow. In fact, it's a family that has very strange pigmentation producing the colour of the flowers. It's not the normal pigments that you find in roses or buttercups. It's a special family of pigments called the betalanes. And our curator here at the garden, Sam Brockington, studies the evolution of those pigments. So he's also interested to understand how the flower is producing these pink pigments that you see on the outer tepals here.
There is one other one for you, Beverly. What is the evolutionary advantage of flowering so infrequently? That's from Amy.
What's the evolutionary advantage of flowering so infrequently? Well, most plants don't flower all the time, if you think about it. Plants have different flowering strategies, so an annual, the weeds in your garden, will basically grow until they can flower and then die. Then you have perennial plants that generally flower at the best time of year for them, and so in our climate that tends to be in the summer when there are more pollinators around. And then you have long-lived plants, so trees and so on, and they have different flowering strategies. Some of them flower at the best time of year, particularly in temperate environments, so you think about our spring flowering trees, but others of them flower, particularly tropical trees, have different ways of synchronizing their flowering because they don't have that same pressure for summer or winter. And so they might flower all at the same time, so it's what we call massed flowering, where all of the plants in a particular species in an area flower at the same time, even though we don't know what the triggers are. So why is it flowering so infrequently? It's an enormous amount of effort to produce this. It's going to cost it a lot of energy, a lot of sugar that it's got to make by photosynthesis, a lot of nitrogen that it has to acquire in probably quite difficult circumstances because it's an epiphyte, it doesn't have its roots in the soil. And so we probably can't afford to do it very often. And then, as I said before, it's also making it very visible to herbivores and increasing its risk of being predated. So it's also probably a strategy to avoid that. Okay, so I'm going to swap with Alex. You'll see me climb down, him climb up. I'll still be around, so if you've got more questions for me, you can always shout them down as well. So excuse us a minute while we do a bit of ladder handling.
Hi there everyone. So I'm sure you've probably seen me up and down this ladder quite often over the past couple of weeks. I've been here measuring the flower, recording it and just keeping everyone up to date with how it's all going, and also fitted all of the rig we see around us. So if I just, have you got any questions there, Helen, or shall I talk about
no, we've got lots of questions.
Okay, I'll take a
can
question.
you explain a little bit about the habitat where it grows naturally?
Okay, so this plant here, and you'll see it's got this amazing habit where it grows around the tree. In fact, the tree we're growing it on here, Pachira aquatica, or the water chestnut, is from exactly the same habitat as our Selene-Cereus vitii, or the moonflower. And that is flooded forests in the Amazon. So if you think Manaus, which is a town or a city right in the centre of the Amazon, and this comes from the Igapo region. And those forests are tropical forests, and for a portion of the year they're flooded. So in the case of this cactus, to avoid having to deal with those floodwaters, it grows as an epiphyte. So that means that the roots of the plant allow it to adhere, in this case, to a structure or scaffold. This is the tree. And this allows it, therefore, to avoid those floodwaters. So usually it grows at the high tide mark. And through doing that, it's able to live in those quite inhospitable environments. In fact, the pads can be fully submerged by water. So if you think, most of us think of cacti from deserts, but in the case of this plant here, this can go through periods of a certain degree of being submerged underwater.
And people are asking about the leaves being wrapped around, and whether they're wrapped around with wire and why. So people are asking about these leaf-like structures and the string that goes around them. So just to confirm, these aren't leaves, these are stems. The cactus has reduced all of its leaves
to spines, essentially. It has these little spiny outgrowths on structures called areoles, which are shortened stems, and then the stem in itself is flattened, and through that it does photosynthesis. That's the process by which it's able to use sun to produce sugars, which it uses for energy. And then in the case of this one here, we obviously got the plant in 2015. We got an initial pad, a single cutting, essentially, and to begin with, that didn't have any roots, so we had to attach it to the stem. By attaching it to the stem, as soon as it touched the stem where it was in close proximity with the stem and moisture, it then rooted. So at that point there, what we did was we used essentially tights that we cut up into short lengths and to tie it on. We've come up with a better product now. We use shearing elastic to do that. And the reason that we continue to tie it in is because we haven't been as confident that those roots are holding it to the stem as we'd like. But as you'll see near the flower, we've actually removed that shearing elastic, and it's absolutely clear that the stems have rooted to the tree. So in years to come, we expect to remove that shearing elastic.
Can we store the pollen and send it to fertilise another plant elsewhere? And also linked to that from Emma is, would there be lots of other moonflower plants flowering at the same time in the wild?
It's a good question. So if we start with pollen, can we store it? Well, we had this question with the Titanarium, which we flowered in 2017, and we're very lucky here on site to have the Sainsbury lab, and the Sainsbury lab have scientists who work on all forms of plant science, and in fact we had some plant science scientists who worked on pollen. So what we did was we wanted to know whether in that tropical plant we could store the pollen. And we initially could show that the pollen was still alive when we froze it, but actually when we tried pollinating our Titanarium in that case, the frozen pollen in all situations, both here and at Edinburgh, didn't produce seed, whereas fresh pollen did. And I would imagine that this, also being a tropical plant, likely has the same detrimental effects on its pollen if we were to freeze it. However, as we showed with our Titanarium, storing the pollen for a number of weeks by refrigerating it is absolutely possible. So what we've done tonight is, because when the flower opened, the stamens were producing pollen, we cut a couple of those stamens off and we put them into the fridge, because at that point, and still is the case now, the stigma was closed. So the stigma essentially looks like a closed fist at the moment, and what we're expecting that to do over the course of the evening is to open up and present the receptive surface. So in that case, if you're looking at my hand now, that would be my palm. And just in case the pollen viability is very short on that, because it's very warm in here, what we've done is we've cut off some stamens already, put the pollen into the fridge, because as Beverly said, we're not even that confident that we'll be successful in pollination, but we want to take all the chances that we can. And what was the other question there?
How frequently does it bloom in its natural habitat?
So in its natural habitat, that's a good question. I think that what we know, or how little we know about this plant, highlights that that's not a question that's very easy to answer. So we know that it would flower around Maytime in its natural habitat, and if you can imagine that it is in the other hemisphere, and it's a short day plant. So what we know is that essentially it needs those short days to initiate flowering. As far as it goes with how often, is it how often? No, how many? How frequently?
Yeah.
Or how many?
How frequently? But also, we have just had another one saying, does it produce just one flower?
So no. So firstly, I think it's difficult to say how frequently it does. But I would imagine that as soon as a plant is reasonably large, we would expect it to be flowering probably every year, if not every other year. When it comes down to number of flowers it's able to produce, well, that comes down to the size of the plant. I have seen pictures of German plants that have up to 4 or 5 flowers on them. So in the case of ours, where we see the flower at the moment is where it gets the sun in the morning, and it's absolutely critical on the plants. They do need that sun on them to mature them and also to encourage flowering. So I expect that in future we should definitely expect at least 1 flower, if not more.
If it does self-pollinate and fruit, where will we put the new plants?
Good question. We have lots of trees in the tropics here. So if we're successful with our pollination and then we get fruit, where will we put extra plants? Well, If that was the case, we would use other tree stems around our main tropics to grow them. We could also grow them on a sort of chicken wire structure with sphagnum inserted in it. That would allow us to produce the same sort of situation as we're getting from the stem of the tree. But actually, our major aim with producing seed would be to share it with other botanic gardens. So whilst we may want one or two other clones of it, the major reason is to share it amongst the network, because that's what we're here for. We're here to encourage research, science and education, and one way we can do that is by sharing our plants.
Do we think we'll be able to collect some nectar to determine the sugar content? That's come from Jake.
That's a question for Beverly rather than me. I'm sure she's heard that, so she...
I'd love to try, but I'm not sure I should try when we've just got the one flower. It needs getting a long pipette down that flower, and I think it might be safer to wait for another year when we've got more flowers.
So I don't know if everyone heard that, but Beverly essentially said that yes, we definitely will try doing that at some point, not on this flower though, so it'll be in future years, because it requires a long pipette that has to go the full extent of the flower, and therefore there is the chance that we damage the flower through that process.
Will the flower last longer if it isn't pollinated?
That's a good question. So usually pollination in flowers, so for example, if you think of orchids, orchid flowers, if you buy a phalaenopsis, they last for ages. But if you accidentally knock the pollinia, so the pollen structures out of the orchid, the flower goes over pretty quickly, because it essentially, in its eyes, has done its job. It's passed its pollen package on. Or if it gets pollinated, equally it goes over pretty quickly because it's done its job. In the case of this flower here, I'm honestly not sure, and it wouldn't be a question I could answer, but I would expect that it probably will last out the full course of the flowering, so 12 hours, because essentially it's a very short period to be set up to go for that, and I'm not sure. That's a really good question.
Other people are asking if it turns towards the moon when it flowers like sunflowers do towards the sun.
Again, I think all these questions require a little bit more data. I think the main effect, what I would probably say was, in the case of our plant here, it's flowering towards the east, so the morning sun. And I think that the light from the day has a much greater effect on the position of the flower than anything like moonlight will.
Can we just do a sound check, Alex, because some people aren't hearing?
Okay, can people hear me? If they can, would they be able to put a thumbs up in the comments box?
And whilst we're just checking, lots of people are asking about the insects that they can see crawling on the tree and whether whether the flower is safe. Okay,
so I've been asked that people are seeing a lot of insects up and down the tree. I can assure you that there is just one species of insect that they're actually looking at, and that's the Australian cockroach. So our glasshouses here have a large sum of Australian cockroaches. These are an introduced species into the glasshouse. When they arrived in the glasshouse, I'm not altogether sure, but they've been here as long as anyone can remember. And they're a species that essentially does very little damage to any other organism except for the plants. So they will busily eat flowers and other such structures. So what we do is we work to try and just reduce their numbers. That might be removing leaf material where they might live, or it might be just repotting things on a regular basis. They're an organism which we don't necessarily want to encourage, but which is relatively harmless to everything except for a lovely juicy flower like the one above us.
How does the seed get onto a tree from the water? Does it germinate in the water?
That's a really good question. So the seeds of this species are really, really cool. So the seeds have little chambers inside them that allow them to be buoyant. So once they drop off, let's say we have a successful pollination, a fruit develops, the fruit opens and the seeds drop into those floodwaters in the flooded forests of the Amazon. Well, they will then float off, and over time they will reach hopefully another tree with a crevice. And when they reach that crevice, they will, if the conditions are optimum and everything goes right, they'll germinate, and that will allow them to start again. Or a new plant to grow, should I say. So if you can imagine, when people record this species from those flooded forests of the Amazon, they see them all above the high tide mark of the waters, and that's because the waters are the main dispersal agent for the seeds.
Does it have a preferred host, and does it damage the tree that it's growing on?
Okay, so we've got two questions here. Does it have a preferred host, and does it damage the tree it's on? So I'll start with the second question because it's by far and away the easiest one to answer. And does it damage the tree? Not in any way. This is an epiphyte, not a parasite. So just to confirm the difference between the two of these, an epiphyte uses the tree as a structure or scaffold to grow on and doesn't take anything else from the tree. In the case of a parasite, it would actually produce a specialised root structure that could plug into the stems and then plug into the vascular tissue to take either water or sugars from that plant. That's not the case in this plant. If the first question, does it have a preferred tree host? That's a really difficult question and not one I can answer because it would require much more detailed surveys of this plant in its natural habitat. And what we are sure of is there's very little literature available on Selena cereus vitii from the Amazon, so that sort of data probably doesn't exist.
Where does it get its nutrients and minerals from?
So, being an epiphyte, the question is where does it get all of its water and minerals from? So, being an epiphyte, this species relies essentially on all the water that dribbles down through its roots behind the pads. Now, rainwater, we tend to look at it and just think it's water, but actually contains a lot more nutrients than we think. So it picks up things like nitrogen when it's up there in the atmosphere. And in fact, as it runs down the tree, it will run through other substrates and any soluble nutrients will be picked up. And those are the things that it will use to grow. It can also build up other debris behind the pads. So the pads don't adhere absolutely tightly to the stem. And in fact, in places, they undulate out from the stem, and anywhere in those situations, debris and leaf litter and other detritus may build up, and from that the plant is able to take nutrients. In the case of ours here, we feed them on a regular basis, and that's using artificial feed.
So another question is it white? Is the flower white because of the hawk moth's vision, and is it just the scent that attracts it?
So I'll attempt to answer this one, and I know this is much more placed for Beverly, but as I understand it, the white flower, so the scent is the more powerful attractant than the white flower, or the white of the petals. But what I do know from reading a paper produced by Bonn is that those petals very heavily reflect UV light. So I think that will have a huge effect on as an attractant from the perspective of the moth's vision. Would that be correct, Beverly?
Yeah, but also the white stands out at night better than a darker colour would. It's a combination.
So Beverly also says that the white stands out a lot better at night. So it will be a combination of those particular characters that allow it to attract the moth in to pollinate. Okay, so I'd like to say thank you for you all watching this evening. It's been great to have all those fantastic questions. So from now, we're going to take the opportunity to pollinate this flower. So that will mean over the course of the coming hours, we'll wait for the stigma to open, and then we'll use pollen to do it at regular intervals. And then we will share our observations with you on the website. And we'll share our observations with you on the website. So what we would encourage you to do is ask any further questions in the comments bar. So if you've got anything relating to research, conservation, or anything else related to the plant, then please put those there, and we'll continue to answer those throughout the evening.
Just before we go, Alex, from Isla, who's 10 years old, will it die tonight?
So it's a good question. People have used the word die a number of times. So will this flower or plant die tonight? So one thing I can say is the plant will not die tonight. The plant will still be here, and as many of you will be aware, the glasshouse is currently closed at the moment, but I can assure you that as regulations change, these glasshouses will open, so people will be able to see this plant in the future. But the flower itself's only got another couple of hours before it's done its job, and it collapses and will wither away. Fingers crossed, we're successful and a fruit develops.
And we should get more flowers next year.
Oh, I very much hope that we get more flowers next year. I think that now that we've flowered it once, we have a plant that's large enough and mature enough to continue flowering, and also that we know what kind of aspect it encourages it to flower. So yeah.
And then will we expect just one flower or maybe multiple flowers in future years?
Will we expect one flower or multiple flower in future years? I absolutely expect it to produce more than one flower in future years. So watch this space really. It's a winter flowering plant. It requires short days. So if you're coming through the gardens in January and February, I really hope that you should expect to see flower buds developing on our Amazon moonflower. I'd like to thank you all, and this is it from us here at Cambridge University Botanic Garden.